Well, good morning. And happy Easter to everyone. Thank you. The Easter resurrection story is certainly a familiar one to all of us. I have read and heard and seen it many times, but each time I do, a new aspect of it just comes alive. And most recently, as I was studying this story in preparation for today's truth lesson, the thing that struck me was how very difficult in the story it was for so many people to accept that Jesus had risen from the dead. It's ironic because Jesus had prophesied his resurrection to his disciples, and it had been prophesied in the Old Testament too. Yet, we're told that even those who were closest to Jesus's inner circle had trouble believing it, at least at first. Why is this so? Well, as you know, at Unity, every person, every place in the Bible is representative of some part of our consciousness. So what is this unbelief all about? I'd like to share with you some of the Easter stories from the Bible that illustrate this point. Let's look first at the Gospel of John, chapters 20, verse 11. We're talking about Mary Magdalene here, who was a very close friend of Jesus's. It says, and I quote, "But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain. They said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping?' She answered, 'Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have lain him.' Saying this, she turned around and she saw Jesus standing right there in front of her, but she didn't know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping? Whom do you seek?' Supposing Jesus to be the gardener, she answered, 'Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have lain him, and I will take him away.' That was Mary Magdalene, one who had known Jesus very, very well, but she did not recognize him. We see another situation in Matthew 28. The Roman guards had just witnessed an event that they couldn't describe and certainly had never seen before. They went into the city and told the chief priests all that they had seen, all that had taken place. Now remember, it was the chief priests and the elders who had conspired to have Jesus condemned to death in the first place because they were afraid of him and they were afraid of his teachings. They gave money to the soldiers and said, 'Tell the people that the disciples came by night and stole away his body while we were asleep.' So the chief priests and the elders not only refused to believe that Jesus had resurrected, but they bribed the Roman guards to tell this lie to anyone who asked what had happened. A third story is in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24:13. It's talking about two of Jesus' disciples. It says, "That very day, two of them were going from Jerusalem to a neighboring town. They were talking all about these things that had taken place and the resurrection. Jesus then himself drew near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Jesus said, 'What is this conversation which you're holding with each other as you walk?' And they stood still, looking very sad. They proceeded to tell Jesus the story about this man who had been crucified, this holy man, and how he had been in the tomb for 3 days and had resurrected. As they were telling this story to Jesus, they still had no idea who he was. None of them recognized him. Now, a fourth and final story, one that many of us are familiar with, is in John 20. It says, "On the evening of that day, the same day as the resurrection, Jesus came and stood among some of his disciples who were in a room together and said, 'Peace be with you.' Then he showed them his wounded hands and his wounded side. The disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. Now, Thomas, one of the original 12, was not with them. So the other disciples later told Thomas, and Thomas answered, "Unless I see the nail prints on his hands and place my fingers in the mark of the nails on his side, I will not believe." Doubting Thomas, as he's often called by us, had been with Jesus for 3 years during his ministry. He undoubtedly heard Jesus foretell of the crucifixion and the resurrection, and yet he still couldn't believe it when he was told the news, even by people who had seen him. These 4 stories illustrate a phenomenon that exists today. Each of these characters in the Bible finds it hard to believe. They represent parts of ourselves that often find it hard to believe spiritual truths. Just as these individuals failed to recognize the risen Christ, so it is that we, in so many ways, fail to recognize the risen Christ in us and in others. Why do we fail to see this risen Christ? And what can we do to regain our vision to see Christ alive once again? To begin with, we should ask the question, what is the risen Christ? Jesus was a man. They called him Jesus the Christ. That is, he expressed the Christ idea fully and perfectly. The Christ is the divinity that was within him. The Christ that was in Jesus is the same Christ that is in you and me. Jesus expressed that Christ, that divinity, to a very full degree. You and I express it to a more limited degree. The spiritual path is about learning to express that Christ consciousness more perfectly and more fully in our lives. The Christ is God individualized in each of us. So what is the risen Christ? The risen Christ is the Christ that is no longer entombed in materiality or in the flesh. The risen Christ comes into full expression in your life. Many people have done this, expressed the Christ in their lives, some continuously, some during peak experiences of illumination. We've all read about them. Many of these people share their experiences later in poetry and music and art. One such person was the great poet William Blake. He shared the grandeur of his experience of seeing the world in terms of seeing only God the good in everything and everyone when he wrote these words. To see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Those words of William Blake about this phenomena express, albeit imperfectly, some of the grandeur of this experience of being able to see and experience the universe, life, as it really is, as God. To see a perfect world and every part of that world, to see the world in a grain of sand, and to see a universe in a flower. This is the vision of seeing one presence and one power in the universe. So why don't we do that all the time? These 4 Bible stories can help answer that question, because these stories illustrate some of the blind spots in our consciousness, some of the things that are within us that keep us from experiencing this one presence and one power in the universe. Let's look at these stories once again, not just as Bible stories or as history, but as characters who live within each of us in our consciousness. The first story was that of Mary Magdalene. She saw Jesus after he had resurrected, and she knew him very well, but she did not recognize him. Why not? Well, the last time, remember, that Mary had seen Jesus was at the crucifixion. That was a very graphic and emotional experience for her. It was an image of Jesus being crucified, executed in a very cruel way, like a common criminal. To see a man whom she loved and respected so much, who was her spiritual teacher and leader, treated this way, suffering so much, had to have a very deep emotional impression on her consciousness. It had to create a very strong image in her subconscious mind. And because this was the image of Jesus that she was holding, she couldn't see beyond that image to the Christ that had arisen. She was still seeing Jesus as the dead Jesus hanging on the cross, and that image blinded her from seeing Jesus as the risen Christ, as he was right then and there in front of her. Mary was blinded by a preconceived image in her mind. We too are blinded by preconceived images. Each of us has had in our lives bad experiences, some of them perhaps graphic, intense, or emotional. These experiences leave an imprint in our consciousness of pain and suffering, of lack, maybe, or limitation. They leave behind in our consciousness images that blind us to the reality of what is here and now, right now, in front of us. Like Mary, we only see the images that are still in our consciousness rather than the Christ that is there before our very eyes. We see not with our physical eyes, we see with our mind. That's always true. We see with our mind. We see through our eyes, but we see with our mind. The mind is what creates the image, not the eyes. The eyes obey the mind. And so it is that we too carry with us images of the dead past. We carry with us limiting ideas about perhaps what was, certainly what is. When we carry with us the pain and hurt, or anger and guilt and unforgiveness of the past, we are blinding ourselves to the reality of the risen Christ that is here right now in front of us, within us. Now, recognizing the pain and hurt and anger and guilt in us and crucifying them, so to speak, or ridding ourselves of them is a necessary part of the process. We can't just be in denial, that's sure, as we've been talking about all during Lent, of course. But the other half of the equation is the resurrection. We must move through and beyond old images of ourselves and negativity. A second story was that of the chief priests. They feared Jesus and tried to do everything they could to get rid of him, but the only thing they ultimately could do was to have him put to death. Even after they did that, Jesus was still there to cause them trouble, at least in their eyes. So they concocted a lie that he had not resurrected. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the chief priests were so self-righteous and so fearful that they absolutely refused to see the truth. There is a Pharisee, a Sadducee, and a chief priest within all of us, and its name is the ego. The ego within us is very self-righteous. Has your ego ever been wrong and admitted that it was wrong? Of course not. Nobody says. The ego cannot admit that it's been wrong, and it will go to any lengths to prove that it's right, and it's very sneaky, as we talk about all the time in Course of Miracles. The ego is afraid of the truth, so it perpetuates lies to keep it alive. And just as the chief priests bribed the Roman soldiers to say that Jesus' body had been stolen, he had not resurrected, so our ego does much of the same thing through the process of rationalization, blaming others, self-pity, denial, or suppressing, very much like the chief priests did. Since the ego is not capable of perceiving the truth, it's best just to leave the ego, just as Jesus left the Sadducees and Pharisees. He knew better than to try to fight them. He just left them alone. And so it is with our ego. Just leave it alone. Recognize that the ego is not the source of the truth. Next, we have the travelers to Emmaus, a town about 7 miles from Jerusalem, which was quite a distance in those days. This is one of the most interesting of the stories. Here, everyone on the trip is talking with Jesus, telling him all about the resurrection and the amazing things this man named Jesus had done, and they still didn't recognize him. Well, those travelers are within us. Those travelers are the parts of us that always think that truth is somewhere else. The travelers were so busy talking about what had happened in Jerusalem that they were not aware of what was happening right there in front of their very eyes. Their consciousness was so affixed to the past and to some other place that they were blinded to the present. They needed to be here now, as Ram Dass said. We often think that the answer to our happiness will come tomorrow, or maybe that our happiness is in the past and gone forever. Or maybe we think our happiness lies in some other person, some other place, and some other job, and some other circumstance. Those travelers are certainly in us too. And they are still walking down the road to Emmaus, blind as ever, still thinking about what was or what might be, talking about what's going on somewhere else, but being totally blind to the risen Christ that was right there with them and is right here with us all the time. Finally, there's our friend Thomas, Doubting Thomas, as he's called. Of course, Thomas is in all of us. He's the part of us that we have to see with our own eyes. We have to touch with our own hands to believe. Thomas demanded physical proof, scientific verification, if you will. Thomas is that part of us that says, I believe only if I can see, touch, perceive with my own senses. Without that, I refuse to believe. Well, Thomas is our intellect. Now, our intellect, to be sure, is a fantastic tool. It's gotten civilization to where we are right now. However, the intellect is also limited. The intellect is very much like a computer. Computers can do incredible things, but they can only come up with an answer that is as good as the data that's been put into it. If it receives limited or faulty data, it's going to come up with a limited, faulty answer. You cannot come up with a right answer with wrong input into a computer. The input to this computer is what we call the intellect. Given the right data, the intellect is beautiful. However, it's limited to what we can see and touch and hear. The truth goes beyond the perception of the senses. It cannot be perceived with the senses. We can see part of the truth through the senses, yes, but we cannot see the entire truth with our senses only. So how can we see the truth? How can we go beyond these blind spots and see the one presence and one power in the universe? In order to answer that, I'm going to refer to one more Bible story. That's in Matthew 15, toward the end of Jesus' ministry. He's having a private rap session with his disciples. He says, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but it gives you the idea. Hey guys, what are the people saying about me out there? What's the rumor? What's on BuzzFeed, Snapchat, Twitter, and Facebook about me? What are they saying? They answered, well, some people say you're John the Baptist. Some say you're Elijah. Some say you're Jeremiah, and some say you're one of the prophets returning. Then Jesus said, but who do you say that I am? You, my disciples. There was silence. And suddenly, Peter spoke up and said, you are the Christ, the living Son of God. Jesus answered, blessed are you. The intellect did not reveal this to you, but your faith, which comes from somewhere else. Peter represents our faculty of faith. Faith is the power that can perceive the risen Christ. Faith is not just hoping. Faith is actually seeing. Unity co-founder Charles Fillmore had a very good definition of faith. He said, faith is the perceiving power of the mind, linked with the ability to shape substance. Faith is twofold. Faith perceives and then creates. Faith perceives the truth, and then it brings that truth into physical manifestation. Thus, we see beyond the limitations of the intellect, beyond the limitations of the ego and all human limitations. When we see God's good, we draw that energy and that power into our lives. Seeing God the good is much, much more than positive thinking. It's much more than just looking for the silver lining in every cloud. It's seeing beyond the cloud to the sun that has been shining all the time. It's seeing the truth of ourselves and of everybody on earth. As goes our faith, so goes our life. Peter was one of the leaders of the disciples. The name Peter in Greek means rock, and faith is the bedrock, the very foundation which our inner Christ rests on. Your whole life revolves around what you believe. Our entire life rests on our faith. What we have faith in is that which we focus on in our lives. When we have faith and we perceive only God the good, then that becomes the bedrock of our lives, the foundation from which we live. At that point, we live in a totally new dimension, in a totally new world. Oh, physically it looks the same, and we don't perhaps look different to other people, but we're not the same, because we then have risen. We too have risen beyond our tomb of physical limitation, as Jesus Christ did in the story. We have resurrected from the old, the limited, the strictly material level of the world, and what poets referred to as living on the right hand of God. As Unity great Reverend Robert Brummett said, we have birthed a greater reality. He is risen. You have risen. You have risen from a world of challenges to a world of possibilities. Amen.